This series is made possible by the generous donation of Stiefel Financial and viewers like you. Thank you.
So oftentimes people say, is there anything I can do so that my home doesn't burn? And I tell people there's a lot of things you can do, but there's still going to be a chance that your home burns. You can dramatically reduce the chance of your home burning, but it will never be completely safe because we live in California. Fire is here before us and it'll be here after us as well. And so when people think about fire, it has a timeline just like any other event. And if you're experiencing fire, a wildfire coming towards you, you might experience embers for about 15 to 30 minutes. Then you'll experience the flame front for another 15 to maybe 30 minutes. And then you would be experiencing embers from all of the burning material around you for another 4-5 hours. And so fire has these distinct parts, and we need to be able to make sure that our properties and our families are prepared for all of these parts. So I always like to think that everyone is an expert in fire physics. It's not just people like myself who have their doctorates in it, because we've all roasted marshmallows around a campfire. So we all know how fire works. We know that if you take your marshmallow and you stick it directly into the center of that campfire, that it's going to catch fire. And that's how homes can get caught on fire as well, kind of that direct flame contact. That might happen if you have juniper on the side of your house and that catches fire and that flame allows your house to catch fire, or if there's a broom leaned up against the house on your back deck. Those are all ways that a house can catch fire from direct flame contact. Houses also catch fire from radiant heat. Houses also catch fire from radiant heat. And a house can catch fire from radiant heat in a few different ways. If you have a nearby structure, another house or an outbuilding that has caught fire, that heat can actually transfer to your home, and that might catch fire. The latest research in fire science shows that the radiant heat from another structure is most likely to catch your house on fire if it's less than 30 feet. So if the structure is more than 30 feet away, the radiant heat from that structure is not as likely to catch your house on fire. So there's some comfort there for people who live further apart. And also when I think about radiant heat, I think about having radiant heat near the house. So if I have a shrub near my house and I have the roof line, and you have an eave here that has a soffit. If there's a shrub right here that's caught fire, even if those direct flames are not touching the house, your soffit is actually going to capture all of that radiant heat, and then it might catch. And so because of the radiant heat, and because of the convective heating and the fact that hot air rises and that your eave is out over that, catching all of that hot air, that area could actually ignite. And so that's one of the reasons that there's a new recommendation for people not to have any combustible materials within 0 to 5 feet of their house, or have a low combustibility zone. So sometimes I hear people say, I got all my defensible space, I'm good, right? And then I look at their house and what I see is not good, because they have defensible space, but they don't have a home that's resistant to fire or a structure that's resistant to fire. Or conversely, there's somebody who has a home that has, 8 panes of tempered glass, but their house is on the top of a ridge, and there's a shrub field beneath them. And ultimately, what I can say is that if that fire were to get close enough to that house, even though you have all of these fancy materials, you're likely still going to suffer some loss, because you still have a lot of vegetation near your home. And so really what's important is to make sure that you have a coupled strategy, that your home is fire resistant and then you also have defensible space, because we know that there's many aspects of a fire that we need to be prepared for. We need to be prepared for the embers. We need to be prepared for that direct flame front, where you might have direct flames on the structure or a lot of radiant heat. But your home has to be ready for all of it. Here we are in Nevada City. And when I look at the area, I see that, we have a downtown area, and then we have more of a suburban area, and then a more of a rural area where people have much larger lots. And when I think about this, we are all at risk of fire, but we have slightly different risks. So if you live in a rural area, there's certain things you can do to reduce the wildfire risk to your home. You can create and maintain defensible space. You can create and maintain a fire-resistant home design. And you really want to be focusing on ember-resistant materials. And when I think about how you can prepare your home, I think an unsung hero is maintenance. It's not very glamorous, it's not very sexy, but that's actually how most homes survive, is by very, very good maintenance. For others, like myself, maybe you can see your neighbor's house. Maybe it's fairly close, within 30 feet. For here, if you live in that environment, you want to make sure that you create and maintain defensible space, and that you create and maintain a fire-resistant home. And a fire-resistant home, for when buildings are close to one another, they still have to be ember-resistant, and they have to have non-combustible and ignition-resistant materials, like multi-pane tempered glass windows, hardy board siding, the types of things that don't combust very easily because you have to be able to sustain radiant heat from a nearby structure. And so when people say, Kate, how can I protect my family and my home? I know that there's many things that you and I can do. We can create and maintain a fire-resistant structure. We can create and maintain defensible space. We can create and maintain signage and access for firefighters and for our evacuation. We can create and maintain a water source for our firefighters, and we can promote community-wide fuel breaks, landscape-wide fuel treatments, and other policies that help find solutions to California's many wildfire problems. And so tonight, I've been talking mainly about fire-resistant structures, but I want you to understand that this isn't the only thing you can or should do. There's this huge variety of things that we need to be doing, working as individuals, all the way working up through our county and our state governments, so that we all need to be engaged in this topic, because it's a big problem, and we all have to work on it together. There's been a lot of research about what is a fire-resistant home. How do you harden a house for wildfires? And many of the studies have been observational studies after wildfires, so we've suffered. Others have been in a laboratory setting. One of the main laboratories for testing is in North Carolina, at the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. They have a huge air hangar where they simulate ember storms from kind of a run-of-the-mill California wildfire that you see here. What I see as a fire scientist when I see this is I see embers coming toward the house. I see them hitting the house and rolling down and away from the house until they hit a rough surface. And that's where they're going to gather. Similarly, if I were to look at my house and see, where do I have piles of leaves on my deck? They're around the base of my deck chairs. They are where the posts join with the deck. Or maybe I have a boardwalk. Those leaves kind of gather underneath the boardwalk. Those are all areas where I see leaves and other debris gathering, and that's exactly where I would expect embers to gather, unfortunately. So here is an example of a home's vulnerability to fire. And when I think about what areas are vulnerable, I think about the roof, the vents, the eaves, the siding, the windows, and things that are attached to the house, like a deck, a wooden fence, maybe a beautiful shrub. And those are all areas where our homes are vulnerable to fire. Today I'm going to be talking mainly about roofs and vents, but only because I have a limited time. And also because these are very important areas to work on. So on a roof, it has many vulnerabilities. A roof has vulnerabilities because it has vents, because it might have skylights or dormers, and because we have rain gutters. These are all areas where embers can land and either go into the house, for example, like a vent or an open skylight, or areas where materials can gather and embers can ignite those materials, which in turn ignite the house. And so when I think about what makes a house fire resistant, sometimes people tell me, I have a cinder block house with a metal roof. There's no way that this can burn. And I hate to tell people this, but I have seen those exact houses burn in the Camp Fire, in the Cascade Fire, in the Tubbs Fire. And the reason is It's not just about the material, it's about the maintenance. The resistance to fire is determined more by the detail of construction than by the materials used in the walls. G.J. Barrow said this after the 1944 Bamaris fire in Australia. They knew at that time that how we maintained our structures was often more important than how the materials that were used to make them. And this is true for many of our houses and buildings that are spaced really far apart from another. This isn't necessarily true if you live within 30 feet of another structure, though. Then materials can become much more important. And so one of the ways that a roof can be vulnerable to fire is if you have a dormer, or if you have a roof that has multiple levels. And what I see in that case is that you have a wall face and your roof. And where they join, you often have an accumulation of pine needles or leaves. And if those fine fuels catch fire, then you'll have that heat on the roof decking, but also on the siding. And so many of us have a fire-resistant roof. We have a Class A roof. But how many of us have a fire-resistant siding? That has not been regulated for as long. And so ultimately, that's an area that's really vulnerable. So for people who have a complex roof, where they have multiple levels of roof and they have a roof hitting a wall or a roof adjacent to a wall, what I would recommend is putting in fire-resistant siding in those locations sooner than later to reduce the chance of a home igniting in that area. Or, if you are looking to build a new house, I would say choose the simplest roof design that you can and make sure that it can shed the pine needles and the leaves that are nearby. California's wildfire problem is new in some ways. It's an old problem, but we're seeing it in this new, unglamorous light where it's really coming into our communities. And so I think, we all really need to think critically and together to find solutions. And some of them might be uncomfortable, but we really have to think about and discuss what values we have. What do we want to preserve or conserve, and when and why? And that's a critical conversation that we all need to be having with ourselves and our neighbors and our bigger communities. So another home vulnerability is vents. Vents have a really important role in your home. Cool air enters at the bottom and then hot air escapes to the top. And by having this air cycling, it actually allows your home to reduce moisture in that space and also not have a dry rot problem. But vents also can be detrimental during a wildfire because all vents, no matter where they are in a house, can allow embers to enter. And they can also allow flames to come in through them if they're close to an object that has caught fire. As a fire scientist, I was searching for where can I find a good vent that's been tested, that's recommended. And I had a really hard time with that. I actually had to email another expert. How in the world do I get to the California Code Chapter 7A compliant vents? Yeah, and so I would say that the vents can be all purchased online for certain, and some of the local hardware stores do carry them. I think it would be great if all of our local hardware stores carried these vents and had displays to help educate people about how they can improve their homes. It's a fairly simple project to do. You can do it in an afternoon. FireWise USA and the National Fire Protection Association created this great graphic to help us understand how we can make our homes more resistant to fire. And they have a new system for defensible space. You all might know of California Code 4291, and that applies if you live in a state responsibility area. But if you live in one of our towns like Grass Valley or Nevada City, then you're governed under your local laws. But no matter who governs your defensible code, all of those were written many years ago, and they're not up to the latest scientific standards and the scientific knowledge. Those codes, were written more than a decade ago. And what I can tell you is that our knowledge has advanced beyond that law. And so I would recommend everyone to look at FireWise USA to see, what are the zones that I should have around my house if I want to reduce the chance that it burns. We need to go further than our laws to protect our property. During a wildfire, you see all of these embers blowing. And these embers can be small or large, and they land every and anywhere around your home. They land on your cushions, on your deck furniture. They land in your gutters. They land in the mulch by your entrance walk to your house. And these embers can catch things on fire. And when I think about these embers, we know that this is actually one of the main ways that homes can succumb to fire is through embers. In this photograph from the Carr Fire that my colleague Jana Valikovic took, there was a beautiful bed that had in their front yard by their entranceway that had some nice shrubs in it and mulch to help maintain them. But ultimately, the embers landed in the mulch and caught fire, and that made the shrub catch fire. And then the heat from that broke the window. The radiant heat broke their double pane tempered glass window, and then it also started to catch the house on fire. These people were really fortunate because they lived next to a water hydrant, and they were even more fortunate than that. There was a firefighter able to actually put water on their house during the Carr Fire. And the unfortunate nature of our fires in California is that we can't really rely on firefighters. When we have a firestorm that goes 30 or 50,000 acres in a day and we lose 1,000, 2,000, 10,000 homes, we can't expect to have a firefighter at our house. Rather, we need to have our homes set up to passively resist fire so that a firefighter needs to do very little to make sure that our homes survive, if anything. And so I often get asked, Kate, what's a fire-resistant plant list? Or Kate, what's a fire-wise plant list? And I always feel bad for how I have to answer this question because I love plants. I have a lot of great plants in my yard. But ultimately, all plants can burn. And so it's really about selecting a plant that has maybe lower heat or lower flammability, making sure that they are spaced apart from one another so you don't have any continuous fuels. And that includes mulch and wooden fencing. It's about the plants and the mulch and the fencing combined. Is that continuous or discontinuous? And then how you maintain those plants. Do you go through once a week and mow your yard? Do you clip away all the dead material? Do you prune and irrigate and clean up after that plant regularly? Another thing that you should do and can do when I think about a fire-wise or fire-resistant plants, oftentimes they have a low growing, they're very short in stature, they have an open structure, they have fewer resins, and they have a higher moisture content. And people say, can a native plant be a fire-resistant plant or a drought-tolerant plant? And yes, they can be, if they have good spacing and they're well-maintained. And one plant that I love quite a lot is manzanita. It's a beautiful plant. I love the sinuous red bark and those kind of dusty blue leaves. It's striking. It's like nature's statue. That particular plant burns really hot. And so it's not a plant that I want within 5 feet of my house, or even maybe 30 feet of my house. I want it near where I live, but because it burns so hot, I don't want it too close to where I live. And in particular with manzanita can burn especially hot if there's older branches that are dead at the base or throughout it, or also if you look to see how pine needles drop over the manzanita. They look like ornaments, like someone took the tinsel and just over the Christmas tree and put it all over the manzanita. When you're out and about, look at this and you'll see, if those pine needles lit, it would likely catch that manzanita on fire. And so when people think about defensible space, they often think about their plants and making sure that they are spaced far apart. But ultimately, defensible space includes everything and anything that'll burn. It includes your trash cans. It includes your wood fencing. It includes the mulch on your ground. It's how all of these things can work together. And so instead of using mulch, whether bark or wood or pine straw or even recycled tire mulch, I would recommend using hardscaping. If you go to some of our local home and garden stores, you can see lots of really beautiful hardscaping that you can incorporate into those areas. You can have rock mulch or, a green lawn that's irrigated and well maintained. Very short. You can incorporate hardscaping around your home. I know for myself, it's been a process. When we first moved in, we took out all of the plants within 5 feet of our house. Our neighbors probably thought we were crazy because we couldn't afford to buy plants yet, or gravel, or the flagstone, and so we had bare mineral soil around our house. But as time has gone on, we've been able to get more rock mulch, and we're really excited about putting in some flagstone paths this upcoming season. So these are all ways that you can incorporate hardscaping around your house, and should. When I think about defensible space, people often think that it's just the plants, but really it's everything that can burn. It's your fence, it's your trash can, it's your mulch. And wood fencing is great for privacy. And you can keep some wood fencing around your house. You just want to make sure that fuels are discontinuous around it. And another way that you can improve your fence is, let's say you had a wooden gate that was adjacent to your house. You can put a metal gate in instead. And that's far less flammable, and it won't track that flame into your house. It's one way to remedy the situation. On a red flag day, I make sure that my broom and my firewood and my trash cans and my porch pillows and welcome mats are all put away. Because if there's a fire and I have to evacuate quickly, I'm not going to have time to take those things in. And so I also have spent a lot of time researching fire-resistant furniture, and so all of my deck furniture is metal, and it's fairly comfortable to sit in without a cushion. And so we don't even use cushions. It's always ready. So it's one less thing that we have to do on a red flag day or if we have to evacuate. So what is a fire-resistant home? A fire-resistant home has to be ready for all aspects of a fire. It has to, its roof, vents, deck, eaves, siding, and windows all have to be resistant to fire, and it also has to have defensible space to protect it. It has a 0 to 5 no fuel zone or low combustibility zone, a 5 to 30 foot lean, clean, and green zone, and then a 30 to 100 foot reduced fuel zone. So one thing I'm always asked is, Kate, can I just put sprinklers on my house? And I have to tell people that they need to be really careful about that. It's just the cherry on top of the cake, really. Because your house has to be able to passively resist the embers that can get into the house, and also making sure that radiant heat doesn't get on your house. Makes sense. But here, in this photograph is the Sperry Chalet at Glacier National Park. And this structure, this beautiful historic structure that is no longer with us, had the protection of a fire core during the wildfire. It was wrapped in metal foil. It had a sprinkler system put on it. And it had firefighters stationed there to put out fires. Ultimately, one of those little pesky embers made its way into the attic, and that is what caught fire and caused the chalet to burn down. And so this building had sprinklers on it, but because it couldn't passively resist the embers going into it, they weren't very effective. Sprinklers can be like a cherry on top of the cake. The cake would be a fire-resistant house, and the icing would be defensible space. And the cherry could help if everything else was in place, but it won't always help, even if your home is fire-resistant, because sprinklers can fail. The power can fail, even if you have a generator. The generator could fail because of radiant heat. It could fail because there's no one there to refuel it. The water could fail because the hose burned. The water could fail because the sprinklers were putting out the moisture, but that moisture evaporated before it hit the structure because of radiant heat. There's so many ways that a sprinkler system could fail. That it's not really recommended until you've done everything else to make your home fire resistant and you have defensible space. Another question I'm sometimes asked is about foams. A foam is something that you could spray onto a building so that it's not accepting heat to reduce the chance that it would burn. And foams have to be applied right before flame front passes through. And they have to be very carefully applied because if there's gaps, you can still have lots of vulnerabilities. And so a foam is something that you might see a professional firefighter doing if an insurance company paid them to foam a house before a flame front. But ultimately, for the average person like myself or you, using a foam just doesn't really make sense. We really need to be focusing our efforts on passive ways to make our homes fire resistant.